Chapter 1. She's dead. Jessica is dead. Jessica Wakefield's identical twin sister, Elizabeth, sobbed wildly into the coarse knit of Luke Shepard's sweater. Her new boyfriend's arms felt warm and safe around her as they had the day before, when Luke had kissed her seriously for the first time. But Elizabeth could not be comforted. Behind her, on the bed of Jessica's room at Pembroke Manor, a body lay face down on blood-soaked sheets, a girl with golden hair. Exactly the same shade as Elizabeth's. The 16-year-old twins had traveled to London for a summer internship at the London Journal. Not a week had gone by before Jessica's new boyfriend, Robert Pembroke, had invited them to spend a long weekend at his family's country manor. Jessica, of course, had been thrilled about the invitation, but Elizabeth had had misgivings from the start. And now, as Elizabeth stared at the blonde-haired body on the bed, she wished they had never even left California. I knew Jessica was in danger, Elizabeth cried, pounding her fists against Luke's hard chest. I should have warned her. I should have warned her. Warned me about what? Said a familiar sleepy voice. Elizabeth whirled, blue-green eyes wide. Jessica was standing in the doorway, yawning. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes looked tired, and her satiny pink nightgown was wrinkled from sleep. But besides being unaccustomed to getting up at dawn on a Saturday, Jessica seemed like a perfectly healthy teenager. You're not dead, Elizabeth cried, almost knocking her sister over with a bear hug. Then who is? Asked Luke. Dead? Why did you think I was? Elizabeth felt her sister's body freeze as Jessica saw the bloody girl on the bed. Oh my! Before Jessica could react further, Andrew Thatcher, London's chief of police, and another weekend guest at Pembroke Manor, pushed past the twins into the room. Behind him was Lord Pembroke himself, accompanied by Lady Pembroke, their son Robert, and several servants. We heard screams, Robert said, staring wildly at Jessica, his eyes full of concern. Are you all right? The chief of police reached for the dead girl's shoulder and gently turned the body over. Then he cried out and stepped back, shaken. The murdered girl was Joy Singleton, his fiancée, and her throat had been ripped open, as if by a wild beast. The words roared into Elizabeth's mind, unbidden. She had first heard them on Monday morning, the twins' first day of work at the London Journal. As high school interns, they would never have been allowed to cover such a grisly murder. But, wanting to be where the excitement was, Jessica and Elizabeth had rushed through their seemingly trivial missing Yorkie assignment, sneaking off to the Essex Street murder scene. Elizabeth would never forget the sight of Dr. Cameron Neville's body lying face down in a pool of blood that was slowly soaking into the floral-patterned carpet. And Elizabeth would never forget the clear, dispassionate voice of Lucy Friday, the London Journal crime desk editor. The victim's throat has been ripped open, as if by a wild beast. The doctor's murder wasn't the first one in London recently to fit that pattern. Elizabeth, Jessica, and Luke, in turn with the arts and literature section of the newspaper, had been doing some sleuthing into the bizarre incidents, and Luke at least was seriously convinced that they were the work of a werewolf. And as if to add credence to the werewolf theory, some of the Pembroke sheep had been found with their throats ripped open just hours before Joy's murder. Elizabeth shuddered, remembering the flowering wolfsbane Luke had pointed out to her in a nearby grove Friday afternoon. According to Luke, who was an expert on werewolves, medieval legend said the wolfsbane bloomed only when a werewolf was hunting prey. She reached beneath the collar of her flannel nightgown to finger the silver pendant that hung around her neck. Luke had given it to her. It will protect you, he had said, clasping the chain around her neck. The pendant showed a five-pointed star, a pentagram in a circle, with the image of a wolf in its center. Normally, Elizabeth would have laughed at the notion of needing protection from werewolves. She had always been considered the rational, responsible twin, unlike her more impulsive sister Jessica. But ideas that would have sounded ridiculous to Elizabeth under the bright California sun somehow seemed more reasonable when voiced through an English fog, especially when voiced by sensitive, handsome Luke. Elizabeth had known Luke for less than a week, but she was falling fast for him, despite her feelings for her boyfriend Todd Wilkins back in California. Besides, the evidence from the other victims did point to a murderer who was not quite human. Now, pleasant if a little vapid, pretty Joy had been murdered in the same way. Elizabeth felt unsteady and was grateful for Luke's steadying hand on her elbow. Her mind was racing. Joy had been murdered in Jessica's room, she thought wildly, in Jessica's bed. In the dark, it would have been impossible for the murderer to tell one sleeping blonde from another. Could Jessica have been the real target? Thatcher, visibly trying to collect himself, seemed to be thinking along similar lines. Jessica, he asked in a strained voice. Joy's room was across the hall from yours. Why was she sleeping in here instead? For once, Elizabeth noted, her sister didn't seem at all concerned about what she looked like. Tears streamed down Jessica's face, and her golden hair was tangled. Jessica had known Joy for only one day, but Elizabeth knew she had liked Thatcher's pretty young fiancé, and the sight of that bloody bed would scare anyone. Except for Robert Pembroke Jr., it seemed. He was as disagreeable as ever, Elizabeth noticed. She scowled as the younger Lord Pembroke turned to two of the servants and began barking out orders. Alistair, he said to tall, thin Alistair Crane, call the constable right away. Set up extra chairs in the parlor, and be prepared to serve tea. He turned to the pretty brown-haired cook. Maria, put the water on and assemble the other servants. Then he placed a protective arm around Jessica's trembling shoulders, and Elizabeth pursed her lips at the sight. She couldn't stand Robert's arrogance and his aristocratic airs, and she hated the fact that he and Jessica had become so close. But Jessica gazed gratefully at him through her tears. Joy knocked on my door in the middle of the night, Jessica explained, haltingly to the chief of police. She asked me to switch rooms with her. She said she couldn't sleep with the full moon shining in her window. Beware the full moon. The words came to Elizabeth's mind out of nowhere, and she remembered the scary old lady hissing them at Jessica the day the twins had arrived at their London dormitories, or housing for international students. A few days later, a gypsy fortune-teller had given Jessica the same warning. Beware the full moon. Jessica seemed calmer now, but as Elizabeth stared at her twin, she felt a wave of terror. Jessica is in horrible danger. Emily Cartwright picked up Saturday morning's edition of the London Journal. Here's another princess story, she exclaimed to her friends Lena Smith and Portia Albert. But that's a frightfully bad little photograph with it. All you can see is a blur of blonde hair. The three girls were huddled around the table in the kitchen of his breakfast. Wouldn't be served officially for another hour, but Emily and Lena were up early for a day of sightseeing, and Portia had an early rehearsal for A Common Man, the play in which she was making her London stage debut. The girls were fixing themselves an early breakfast of toast and orange marmalade. I suppose it's because I'm Australian, Emily said, gesturing with a newspaper. But I do not understand this all-consuming passion you Brits have for gossip about the royal family. I was addicted to it when I first got here. But now even I'm getting tired of it. Sometimes I don't understand it myself, Lena remarked, running her fingers through her short brown hair. So Portia, what time is your play rehears? Listen to this morning's bit, Emily interrupted, pointing to a banner headline across the front page of the newspaper. Witnesses spot princess in Tokyo. 2 London residents were on holiday Thursday in Japan, where they claim to have seen Princess Eliana, missing since last week, in a Tokyo bathhouse. That's preposterous, Portia exclaimed. What would the youngest daughter of the Queen of England be doing in Tokyo? Taking a bath apparently, Lena said dryly. Does the article cite any evidence? Portia asked in her elegant, cultured accent. No, that's the odd part, said Emily. The article goes on to quote the police as saying the witnesses were probably mistaken. There's no proof at all. My internship may be with BBC television instead of a newspaper, but I know enough about newspapers to know this is shoddy journalism. What were the editors thinking to run such a dicey story on page 1? I suppose they were thinking, this article will sell a lot of newspapers, Portia remarked. Lena reached for the journal and ruffled through it. Here's an advertisement for your play, Portia, she exclaimed in her charming Liverpudlian accent. Listen to this. Young Penelope Abbott, playing the part of Isabel, is the most exciting thing to hit the London stage since Felicity Kendall. That's just super, Portia. I'm sorry I couldn't go with everyone on Thursday night. I can't wait to see it. Emily laughed. I'm not surprised about your rave reviews. You practiced the part of stuck-up Isabel Huntington so diligently 24 hours a day, that we all believed you were an insufferable snob. I've heard of dedication, but even an actress has to be at leisure now and then. Once again I do apologize, Portia said with a formal bow. I don't know how you all ever forgave me. I really got carried away. Lena laughed. We're just thankful you weren't rehearsing for the part of Jack the Ripper. It's too bad you can't use your real name in the cast, Emily said. Have you called your father in Scotland yet to tell him that you landed a role? I would think he'd be pleased that you want to follow in his footsteps. Maybe someday you'll be as famous an actor as he is. No, I haven't told him, Portia said. And I'm not sure I will. I told you. The venerable Sir Montfort Albert disapproves of my ambition to be an actress. He claims it's too hard a life, and he's not certain I have the talent to make a go of it. That's why I haven't told him I got this role and why I'm using the stage name Penelope Abbott. I had to learn what I'm capable of on my own. I couldn't let my father's name influence people's reactions to my work. Sometimes you have to get away from your past before you can find out who you really are, Lena said thoughtfully. Emily stared at her curiously. She liked Lena a lot, but sometimes the girl from Liverpool said the oddest things. Portia didn't seem to think it was odd. Then I guess I've learned that I am an actress, she said. I still don't know if I've any real talent, but I do know that it's all I've ever wanted to do. Now that I know what it's like to be on stage in a professional production, I want to act more than ever. I just hope I can someday convince my father and make him proud of me. You will, Lena said staunchly. Well, speaking of being an actress, Portia said, rising from her chair, I have to get to rehearsal. Break a leg, Emily called as she left the room. That is the expression, isn't it? Emily had plenty of faith in Portia's talent, but she thought the conversation had become much too serious. I miss the American twins, she said suddenly. This place was much jollier with them around. Lena smiled. Yes, it certainly was. Emily sighed jealously. It's bad enough that Jess and Liz are gorgeous and nice, but within a few days of arriving in the country, Jessica snagged a real English nobleman. It's not fair. Robert Pembroke is one of the most eligible guys in London, Lena admitted. And Elizabeth hooked up with that cute, sensitive Luke from the journal. Not to mention the torch that René Glyze is carrying for her. The best looking boy at his. Who could have guessed that he knew the twins from their trip to France? And now he's here working for the French embassy. Face it, Lena, she concluded. Coincidences like that only happen to people like Jessica and Elizabeth. They obviously lead charmed lives unlike normal, everyday blokes like you and me. Lena smiled enigmatically. Of course, Emily continued in her characteristic non-stop fashion. It's a shame that René is jealous of Luke and has been giving Liz the cold shoulder all week. I know, Lena said. Liz just wants to be friends with René, so he won't even talk to her. Emily sighed. Until René gets over Liz, he's no good as potential boyfriend material. So except for Gabriello Moretti, who already has a girlfriend, it seems that the twins between them have tied up all the good-looking guys around. Not all of them, Lena pointed out. Emily smiled. David Bartholomew, right? Am I that transparent? Lena blushed. You're so honest, Lena, that you couldn't keep a secret if your life depended on it. Everybody at his knows that you and David are crazy about each other. We're ready to take wagers on when you'll finally give in to all that passion and go out on a date. So when's it going to be? Lena blushed again. Tonight, she said. Liz finally convinced me that I should, as the Americans say, go for it. Liz would know, Emily says. Look where she and her sister are right now. Guests of Pembroke Manor. I bet they're having a fantastic time. A half hour after Joy's body was found, Jessica sat next to Robert on an overstuffed sofa in the Pembroke's parlor, drinking a cup of tea. Now that she was away from the bedroom and those bloody sheets, the murder hardly seemed real. She leaned against Robert's shoulder and put the gory scene out of her mind, concentrating instead on the excitement of being in the middle of a real English murder mystery just like in an Agatha Christie book. The sumptuous furnishings and aristocratic people around her were pretty exciting too. Jessica thought of Lila Fowler, her best friend back home in California. Lila was the daughter of a millionaire, but even Lila wasn't related to royalty like the Pembrokes. She would be green with envy when she heard about the people Jessica was hanging out with. The Pembroke family, their staff and the weekend guests were assembled in the parlor for questioning by the local authorities. Thin regal Lady Pembroke was sitting ramrod straight, on the edge of an upholstered chair. Even at this hour of the morning, Jessica marveled. She was perfectly coiffed and made up. Lord Pembroke was nervously pacing back and forth across the thick oriental carpeting. But it was their son Robert to whom Jessica's thoughts kept returning. She loved his classy English clothing and his handsome face, but she was even more impressed by his confident manner, and how he took command of every situation. At the murder scene earlier today, the others had stared at the body in shock, but Robert had known exactly what to do. He had set the servants in motion and instructed everyone to meet down here to wait for the authorities. Now she snuggled against his strong body, feeling safe and secure. Elizabeth and Luke huddled together on a sofa that faced the one Jessica sat on. Elizabeth, as usual, held a small notebook in her hand. Leave it to my twin, Jessica thought. She never can give those reporters' instincts a rest. Elizabeth was scribbling wildly in her notebook, stopping only when she noticed the police constable's unfriendly glare. Constable Sheila Atherton, a small, dark-haired woman in her mid-30s, stood near the sofa, looming over Elizabeth in a way that made her look much larger than her short stature. You say that you and your sister are from a village called Sweet Valley, California? She asked in a no-nonsense voice. Thunder crashed outside the window, punctuating the constable's question and whipping the light morning drizzle into a downpour. Village? Jessica thought. How very English. Frequently she found herself annoyed and mystified by the unfamiliar words she'd been hearing in England. British English and American English were very different languages she was learning. But in this setting, the parlor of a British manor house, words like village seemed absolutely right. She would have to get Robert to teach her how to talk that way. That's right, Elizabeth answered the constable's question. We're in London for a summer internship, and the Pembrokes invited us to spend the weekend here. The constable drained her teacup and set it on the table with a loud clank. Dawn was hardly a civilized hour to be roaming about the corridors this morning, Miss Wakefield. How did you happen to discover the body? I was worried that Jessica might be in danger, Elizabeth explained, so I ran down the hall to her room and saw the victim. Lord Pembroke, still pacing, wheeled abruptly, nearly crashing into the tall, thin man who was carrying in a tea tray. Pembroke sat down quickly in a straight-back chair as the servant righted the tray and carried it to the table in front of the constable. Jessica heard the silver serving pieces clinking together. The servant's hands were trembling. Apparently the murder had set the whole household's nerves on edge. The constable poured herself a second cup of tea. But why were you worried, Miss Wakefield? What would make you suddenly believe your sister was in danger? Elizabeth blushed. It may sound silly, but I had a nightmare about it. The constable raised her eyebrows. And when I woke up, Elizabeth continued staunchly, I just knew there was something wrong. Jessica spoke up helpfully. It happens to us all the time. It's because we're identical twins. Oh, really? The constable asked sarcastically, taking in the girls. Identical heart-shaped faces, blue-green eyes, and slim athletic figures. Even their California suntans were exactly the same shade, though they were starting to fade after a week in foggy England. I hadn't noticed. Thatcher rose from his chair, an imposing figure even in his grief. What did you do when you entered the room, Elizabeth? He asked in a tightly controlled voice. Constable Atherton cast the police chief a dark look. With all due respect, sir, this is not London, she reminded him, and we are out of your jurisdiction. I am conducting this investigation if you don't mind. Andrew turned his back on her and stared instead at the rain-soaked gardens outside the window. Elizabeth glanced over at him, her eyes full of sympathy. Then she took a deep breath and spoke to the constable. I walked into the room and saw everything. It was Jessica's bed, so I thought it was Jessica. Igesi started screaming. Then Luke came running in. A minute later Jessica showed up. The constable turned to Luke. And why were you roaming the halls at sunrise, young man? I wasn't, he said quietly. I was having trouble sleeping. I heard Elizabeth scream, so I ran out of my room to find her. Lord Pembroke spoke up suddenly. I hardly see that this line of questioning is leading anywhere, he said in his booming voice. You don't honestly believe that this girl is the murderer, do you? I admit it's unlikely, the constable replied evenly. But everybody is a suspect. She glared at him thoughtfully. And I do mean everybody. Lord Pembroke seemed awfully nervous. Elizabeth noticed as the family patriarch sat down. Of course anyone would be jumpy after what had happened in Jessica's room that night. But Elizabeth thought his reaction seemed extreme, especially coming from a man so accustomed to affecting the cool, superior demeanor of the British aristocracy. Elizabeth wrote a line in her notebook. Keep an eye on the elder Pembroke. She gazed around the room again, thankful that the constable seemed to be finished with her for now. Everybody in the room was a suspect, the constable had said. So who else appeared to be hiding something? Elizabeth gazed thoughtfully at the servants. Tall, thin Alistair had seemed friendly and innocuous when she had met him the day before. She could hardly believe he was a killer, but she had noticed his hands shaking as he set down the tea tray. Why, maybe he knew more than he was saying. Alistair whispered something to Maria Finch, the Pembroke's pretty, plump cook. She stared at the rich red carpeting, wringing her hands. Elizabeth was afraid the woman would burst into tears. Was Maria hiding something as well? Elizabeth resolved to question the two servants herself later. Alistair. A calm, commanding voice reproached suddenly. You forgot the lemon. Elizabeth focused thoughtfully on young Robert Pembroke, who sat with his arm around Jessica. Alistair bowed apologetically. I beg your pardon, sir, he said. I'll fetch it right away. He turned on his heel and disappeared through the double doors. Elizabeth shook her head disapprovingly. Ever since she'd come to Pembroke Manor, she'd been annoyed by the way the Pembrokes treated the lower classes. She had never heard a please or a thank you out of Robert. He took it for granted that people would cater to his every whim. She hated his commanding tone and bossy manners. Now, Elizabeth had to admit, Robert had a concerned expression on his face, especially when he looked at Jessica. But unlike his father and the servants, Robert didn't seem nervous. In fact, he looked particularly cool and regal. Somehow, he, like his parents, had found time in the last 20 minutes to dress fully. His cravat was expertly tied and his dark hair was combed. Robert was handsome, certainly, and Jessica was crazy about him. Still, Elizabeth couldn't stand his smug, superior way of looking down his nose at people. Of course, that didn't make him an animalistic murderer. We all have an animal side, she found herself writing in the notebook. For a moment the sentence startled her, as if someone else had written it. There. Then she remembered Luke using those words earlier in the week as he and Elizabeth toured the eerie werewolf exhibit at the Wax Museum in London. We all have an animal side. As much as Elizabeth hated to admit it, she had to agree, especially after what had happened early Saturday morning. Thank goodness for sweet, gentle Luke, Elizabeth thought, feeling the warmth of his fisherman's sweater against her shoulder. The young poet was becoming more important to her with every passing day, making it disturbingly easy to put out of her mind the image of Todd Wilkins, her boyfriend back in California. In fact, to Elizabeth, sitting in the parlor of an English manor house the morning after a murder, California seemed like another planet altogether. She was startled out of her thoughts by Constable Atherton, who wheeled abruptly to face Jessica. A girl was murdered last night in the bed you were supposed to be sleeping in, the constable reminded Jessica. Tell me, Ms. Wakefield, who might want you dead? Jessica shrugged her shoulders comically. Well, there's Lila Fowler, but she's still back in Sweet Valley. Other than her, I can't imagine. Elizabeth smiled. She could always count on Jessica to cover up her anxiety with a joke. The constable's eyes narrowed. This is a serious situation, Ms. Wakefield. Do you have any enemies? Jessica rolled her eyes, and Elizabeth realized she wasn't covering up her fear. She wasn't afraid at all. She doesn't take any of this seriously. Elizabeth realized with dismay. She thinks she's the star of an Agatha Christie play. Jessica shrugged her shoulders. I'm one of the most popular people in my town, and I hardly know anyone within about 1,000,000 miles of here. Besides, I'm only 6. She stopped and glanced at Robert. I'm only a teenager, she concluded. Elizabeth sighed. realizing that Jessica must be pretending to Robert that she was older than 16. Leave it to Jessica to be worried about keeping a rich, handsome 20-year-old interested in her, even with a murderer on the loose. Face it, Jessica said to the room full of people. I couldn't have been the target. Nobody would want me dead. It was just a random murder like that doctor who was killed in London last week, and the nurse before that. The chief of police turned from the window and stared at Jessica curiously. Elizabeth held her breath. Leave it to Jessica to open her big mouth. Nobody was supposed to know that the girls had been at the Essex Street murder scene. And only someone who had been there and seen the body would make the connection between Dr. Neville's death and Joy Singleton's. And no information had been released about a connection to the death of a nurse the month before. Despite the fact that the police must have noticed similarities between the cases, somebody or something had ripped out the nurse's throat too. For some reason, London Journal editor Henry Reeves had not printed the details of the doctor's death. Lucy Friday had been crime desk editor at the time and she had quit her job over the decision. Jessica and Elizabeth were determined to find out why Reeves or the journalist's owner, Lord Pembroke, himself would cover up such important news. But now Jessica may have tipped their hands. Andrew opened his mouth to question Jessica, but Lord Pembroke beat him to it. The older man jumped from his chair again, knocking it over with a clatter. What do you mean, Miss Wakefield? Lord Pembroke asked sharply. Why would you compare last night's slaying to the death of Cameron Neville? Jessica glanced apologetically at Elizabeth. Then she smiled at Lord Pembroke. That's just what I meant, she explained sweetly. Both were completely random incidents. There is no connection. Let's stick to the facts of the case at hand, please, the constable insisted. Ms. Wakefield, at approximately what time did Miss Singleton come to your room? Jessica shrugged. Sorry, but keeping track of the time isn't one of my strong points, she said. I don't even wear a watch in the daytime, let alone in the middle of the night. The constable's expression was venomous. Could you hazard a guess? Jessica shrugged again. I don't know, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I suppose. The constable turned around slowly, staring in turn at every person in the room. Was anyone else awake this morning between 2 o'clock and, shall we say, 5 o'clock? Elizabeth shook her head quickly and saw that most of the others did too. But she noticed that Maria looked down at the floor, blushing as red as the expensive oriental carpet that covered it. The constable noticed too. Miss Finch, may I remind you that this is an official police investigation? Were you awake at that time this morning? Maria nodded slowly, still looking down. Yes, ma'am, she replied barely. Above a whisper. Alistair had returned to the room a few minutes earlier with a dish of lemon wedges for the tea. Now he stood beside Maria, and she clutched his arm tightly as she spoke. I'm always up and about early, Maria stammered, to prepare the morning meal, you know. She paused, a frightened look on her face. But I didn't see a thing, ma'am. I swear it. I was mostly in the kitchen anyways. The constable glared at her suspiciously. Very well, she said at last. I suppose you can all go about your business for now. But don't anyone leave the country without first notifying my office. As the group began filing out of the parlor in the direction of the dining room, Luke leaned over to whisper in Elizabeth's ear. Doesn't it seem odd to you that we're calmly preparing to eat brunch, just hours after a murder? Elizabeth nodded. You know how these Pembrokes are caught up in tradition. She whispered back. If the custom is to eat brunch on Saturdays, they certainly wouldn't let a little thing like a murder get in the way. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Lord Pembroke tap Andrew Thatcher on the shoulder as if asking him to stay behind in the parlor. You go on with the rest, Elizabeth whispered to Luke. I'll catch up with you in a minute. Elizabeth turned back to the parlor and peered into the room around the edge of the open door. The two men stood facing the window, their backs to her. Elizabeth felt a twinge of conscience about eavesdropping but put it out of her mind as Lord Pembroke began to speak. The older man patted Thatcher's shoulder in a paternal manner. Just a little more time, Andrew, he said. It's too good an opportunity to pass up. Thatcher whirled to face him. But Joy, you know how sorry I am about your young lady, Thatcher. But it doesn't change anything. This is still the chance of a lifetime. We only have to hold on a little longer. Andrew turned back to the window and nodded, almost imperceptibly. Elizabeth had to strain to hear his next words. All right, Robert. As you wish. Lord Pembroke steered the younger man toward the door. Elizabeth darted behind it and scrunched her body against the wall, scribbling down everything they had said. Then she followed them down the hall, keeping what she hoped was a safe distance as she pretended to admire the paintings of stern-looking relatives who stared accusingly from the richly brocaded walls. Constable Atherton met the two men at the end of the hallway. Gentlemen, she said in a low voice, I have been thinking about the comment young Ms. Wakefield made concerning the unfortunate incidents in London. You must be involved in that investigation, Chief Thatcher. Do you believe there is any connection? There was a pause before Andrew's voice answered.
No, constable.
I honestly do not believe there is a connection between the two deaths in London or between those deaths and this one. There is no evidence to support such a link. Elizabeth's eyes widened as the threesome disappeared into the dining room. She struggled to copy down Thatcher's exact words, incredulous that the police would lie about the fact that 3 murders had been committed in exactly the same gruesome manner. For murders she corrected herself, thinking about poor Poo-Poo the Yorkshire Terrier. The story of Poo-Poo's disappearance had been the twins' first assignment for the journal. The case had seemed insignificant at first, but it had taken on a chilling tone when Elizabeth found the little dog's lifeless body on a London street corner Monday night, its throat torn open. Elizabeth scribbled one more line in her notebook. Who is Thatcher trying to protect? Suddenly, a strong hand locked on Elizabeth's wrist. She jumped, slamming the notebook shut. Lord Pembroke's voice sounded in her ear, calm, but with what Elizabeth thought was a note of menace. I've seen you writing in that tablet of yours, he said. Don't entertain any grand ideas about getting your byline in the paper with any of this. The young woman's death is of no interest in London. It's local news. That's all. He dropped her wrist abruptly and glided to the other end of the room, not looking back. Elizabeth flushed guiltily. She had been imagining her byline on page 1 of the London Journal, on an article that covered something more important than an exploding eggplant or a missing dog, which were the kinds of stories she'd been assigned all week. Of course Pembroke owned the journal. If he really was covering up information about the murders, her chances of exposing him in the newspaper were slim. Still, she was determined to learn the truth. She turned back to her first page of notes and underlined a sentence. Keep an eye on the elder Pembroke. She studied him as he stood with Robert, Jessica, and an uncomfortable-looking Luke. Poor sensitive Luke. He hated being around rich, snobby types even more than Elizabeth did, but he had come to spend the weekend here because Elizabeth had asked him to. Now Luke was staring, eyes narrowed, at both Pembrokes as Jessica carried on what appeared to be an animated monologue. The Pembrokes ignored Luke completely. Robert's eyes never left Jessica's face, and even Lord Pembroke seemed to relax, caught in the spell of Jessica's vivacity. Elizabeth noticed that the dining room was decorated with safari trophies. From the wall over Jessica's head, a tiger's mouth gaped open, its dagger-like teeth glistening in the morning sunlight. A sense of dark foreboding washed over Elizabeth, and she felt as if she were drowning. And again she heard Luke's words in her mind, so clearly that she almost turned to see if he was standing beside her, whispering in her ear. We all have an animal side. Chapter 2. Thanks for the snack, Maria, Elizabeth said, sitting at the work table in the huge kitchen of Pembroke Manor. Your homemade cookies, I mean biscuits, are first rate. Oh, it's no bother at all, Miss Wakefield, the plump, pretty cook replied. I guess I wasn't feeling very hungry at brunch, Elizabeth said carefully. After what happened this morning. Maria turned away quickly, but not until after Elizabeth caught a frightened look in her brown eyes. Once again, she was certain that the cook knew more about Joy's murder than she had told the constable. Alistair walked into the kitchen, carrying a dust rag, and Elizabeth noticed the familiar way he rested a hand on Maria's shoulder as he leaned over to whisper something in her ear. She smiled up at him gratefully, as if he'd offered words of encouragement. Maria wasn't the only person who was grateful for Alistair's presence. Elizabeth wanted to question both of them, somewhere out of earshot of the Pembrokes. Now was her chance. Would you care for more biscuits, I mean cookies, miss? Maria asked. No, thank you, Maria. Actually, I wanted to talk with both of you for a moment. About last night. Maria's face turned white, and Alistair began clasping and unclasping his hands. As I told the constable, miss, Maria said. I was awake at the time, but I didn't see a thing near Miss Jessica's room. Interesting, Elizabeth thought. I didn't mention Jessica's room, and Maria had implied to the constable that she'd been only in the kitchen that morning. I heard what you said to the constable, Elizabeth replied carefully. I was just wondering if you'd remembered anything else since you talked to her. Maria stared at the linoleum. Not a thing, miss. I know what it's like to be awake in the dark when everyone else is asleep, Elizabeth began slowly. Sometimes you hear noises and they scare you, but you tell yourself it was only the house settling or the wind rattling the gutters. Did either of you hear anything like that this morning? Alistair's hands were trembling again. Alistair, the constable never asked you directly. Were you awake at all? Between 2 and 5 this morning. He sat down limply at the work table. We would like to oblige you, miss, he said in a tense whisper. But we mustn't. We could lose our positions if Lord Pembroke were to find out. So that was it. They were terrified of their employer. The realization made Elizabeth even more determined to discover exactly what Pembroke's role was in all of this. What was he hiding? She knew she would have to proceed slowly. With Alistair and Maria. Somebody is trying to cover up the facts of some murders here and in London, Elizabeth said. I'm investigating to find out the truth. I won't tell anyone. You spoke to me. You won't tell young Master Pembroke? Maria asked.
Maria, no.
Alistair begged. It's too dangerous. Please, Alistair. A young woman is dead. If we can help Miss Wakefield find the killer. She hesitated. Nobody will ever know you talked to me, Elizabeth assured her. A good journalist never reveals her sources. Maria swallowed hard and then began to speak haltingly. The moon was full last night, she said, and Alistair and I crept out for a romantic walk in the gardens an hour before I was to begin the morning's work in the kitchen. Of course we stayed quite close to the house, what with the poor sheep that were found dead and all. We had just come inside around about 4 o'clock, and were at the end of the upstairs corridor. We had come upstairs for clean table linens for the morning meal, Alistair interjected, drumming his fingers nervously on the wooden table. We planned to bring them down the servants' stairway at the end of the hall, and somebody was in the hallway leaving Miss Jessica's room, Maria blurted out. Elizabeth felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Who was it? She asked, breathlessly. I heard footsteps in the hallway, Alistair admitted. Alistair didn't see the person, Maria said. Only me. He already had the stairway door open and was about to head down the steps. Of course it was very dark, she added. I really couldn't tell who it was in the corridor. Can you give me any information at all about the person you saw? Elizabeth asked. Hair color? Height? Clothing? Maria shook her head and refused to meet Elizabeth's gaze. Tears glistened in her dark eyes. Now more than ever, Elizabeth was sure Maria knew or could guess at the identity of the person in the hallway, but she was obviously too frightened to say more. It was very dark, Maria repeated. It's awfully early for it to be so dark. Jessica clasped Robert's hand tighter, as if she were frightened by the drifting English mist in the boxwood garden. It was twilight on Saturday, except for anguished Andrew Thatcher, who had driven back to London after brunch. The guests at Pembroke Manor had spent a quiet day indoors, recovering from the morning's horror and avoiding a torrential downpour that had finally stopped late in the afternoon. Jessica wasn't really cold, but she shivered. Robert draped his strong arm around her shoulders, which is just what she had wanted him to do. We can go back inside if you'd like, he said. I know you've suffered a terrible shock. It's beastly of me to keep you out in this sort of weather. Oh no, Jessica said. It feels good to get out in the fresh air after being cooped up inside with everyone all afternoon, even if it's so misty I can hardly see the garden. Besides, I feel perfectly safe with you. I know you would never let anything hurt me. Robert smiled down at her, and Jessica felt her knees turn to jelly. He was definitely the best-looking guy she had ever dated, and being fabulously wealthy and part of the British aristocracy didn't hurt. Despite the damp weather, Jessica suddenly felt warm under his gaze. You poor girl. You're still unsteady. I'm horribly sorry you've had to endure such trauma while a visitor at my home. I suppose it doesn't say much for the Pembroke hospitality. Oh, Robert. It's not your family's fault that such an awful thing happened to poor Joy. And just because it happened in my own bed doesn't mean I'm frightened or anything. Of course, Jessica admitted to herself, she had been frightened at first. Now, she felt completely recovered, but there was no reason to act like she was. Not when he was being so attentive. Traumatic experiences had their uses. You are so brave, Jessica, he said, squeezing her hand. I'm proud of you. Even I am feeling a bit troubled about the situation. Murder has taken place in my own home. But you are determined not to let it spoil everyone's weekend. Jessica smiled shyly. Robert, I want you to know how much I appreciate your invitation to visit your family's beautiful country home. She gestured around the garden, knowing that sculpted hedges and tasteful flower beds hid beneath the shroud of mist. Despite what happened to Joy, I've had a great time this weekend with you. He frowned. I'm just sorry it's about to end. Do you have to take the first train in the morning? Well, Jessica pretended to hesitate. Elizabeth is a real stickler when it comes to punctuality. Robert grinned. I've got an idea. Allow me to make it up to you for the horrendous weekend. I know this smashing restaurant in Windsor. Takes weeks for most people to get reservations, but the owner is a friend of my family's. I'll arrange a table for tonight. In the morning you can sleep as long as you like, and I'll drive you back to London at your leisure. How does that sound? Heavenly, Jessica declared, thinking of an evening alone with Robert. His luxurious silver Jaguar convertible. You know, I really could get used to this lifestyle, Robert. You always seem to get the best and the nicest of everything. Robert stared into her eyes. You deserve nothing but the best and the nicest. Then he leaned over and pressed his warm, soft lips against hers. A warm tingling spread through Jessica's body as she returned his slow, ardent kiss. Afterward, she stood for a few minutes in Robert's arms, breathing the heady scent of his cologne and gazing over his shoulder at the wisps of fog that drifted across the yellow face of the moon. Late that night, Elizabeth stood in the dark corridor outside the door of the room that Joy Singleton had died in. She looked down the long, dim hallway in both directions and then breathed a sigh of relief. It was empty. The train for London would leave first thing in the morning, so this could be Elizabeth's last chance to search for clues. Robert and Jessica were out for a late dinner in nearby Cambridge. The Pembrokes and their servants had gone to bed, or were busy in other parts of the great house. Andrew Thatcher had returned to London that afternoon, and Luke was in his room studying the werewolf lore that had always been a hobby for him, but had lately become an obsession. Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt at investigating Joy's death without letting Luke know. After all, they were in this together. It wasn't that she wanted to keep secrets from him exactly, but Luke was so convinced about his werewolf theory that Elizabeth was afraid he wouldn't keep an open mind about any clues they might discover. Of course, she said under her breath, Luke may be right. Just might be werewolf. But a good journalist has to consider every possibility. She entered the room and quietly pulled the door shut behind her. Clues, she said aloud. But where should she look for them? The crime had taken place on the bed, of course. Elizabeth's heart began pounding as she approached it. The scene was there before her, the body that looked like Jessica's, the golden hair, the crimson blood that soaked into the sheets and dripped steadily into a small pool on the parquet floor. She shook her head to clear it of the image. Of course the bed was empty now, cold and bare of linens. The only sign that remained of the morning's crime was a round reddish-brown stain on the floor beside the bed. Clearly, no clues were left on the bare mattress. She scanned the tastefully furnished room. An armoire stood in one corner, its doors wide open to reveal an empty interior. No doubt it had already been searched by the police. Of course the police must have searched the entire room. But they might have missed something, Elizabeth told herself. Something important. She traced what might be the murderer's footsteps. The killer must have entered through the door, walked across the rug to the bed, murdered Joy, and skulked out to be seen by Maria Finch, who had been standing near the door to the servants' stairs at the far end of the hallway. Elizabeth peered at the rug that covered much of the floor. There was no trace of the killers having crossed it. Not that Elizabeth had really expected to find any. What else in the room did the murderer touch? She asked herself. Then she realized she was staring at the answer. The door. Elizabeth inspected the shiny brass door handle. As expected, she found nothing. The constable's assistant had dusted it for fingerprints that morning, and the servants had polished it carefully afterward to remove the powdery black dust. What's this? She whispered, running her hand up and down the wooden door frame. Caught in a crack in the wood were some silky threads from some kind of dark green fabric. At last she had found some evidence. But there was more. She pulled a small wad of a wiry material out of the crack. Chills raced up and down her spine as she realized what she was holding in her hand. It was a piece of animal fur with long coarse hairs. The applause was over. The curtain had closed on Saturday night's performance of A Common Man. But the biggest standing ovation yet was still ringing in Portia's ears as she stood backstage, tired but exhilarated. She felt a small hand clasp her shoulder. Great work, Penelope, said tiny, dark-haired Adrian Ronnie, a cast member who was about Portia's age. That was your best performance yet. After chatting for a moment, Adrian walked to the stage door where a beaming, middle-aged couple waited for her. Portia sighed as she watched Adrian embrace her parents. What's the sigh for, Portia, or should I say Penelope? Asked a voice behind her. Renee, Portia exclaimed, glad to see the tall, handsome French boy. How did you like the performance? The play was très bon, excellent, and you were even better. I am pleased that I was finally able to see it. But why did you sigh so sadly? Portia smiled. Oh, I do feel great about tonight's show. I just wish my parents could be here and feeling great about it too. Without my father's support, even the standing ovations seem empty. So invite your papa to tomorrow's show. Portia bit her lip. You know, my father is actually here in London at the moment. He arrived today from Scotland for a meeting with the Royal Shakespeare Company. Then she sighed and shook her head. But it's not that easy, Renee. You know how he feels about my chances of making it as an actress. The important thing, Portia, is this. How do you feel about your chances of making it as an actress? I don't know, Portia said, biting her lip. Maybe my father's right. Anyone can get lucky in one little play. Perhaps I don't have enough talent to make a career of acting. And perhaps you do. Personally, I believe you must. Only an actress par excellence could have created the illusion that you created at his in the last few weeks. You portrayed Isabel so well that we all, as Jessica would say, hated your guts. Only now can I truly understand why you were being such a royal pain in the neck. He laughed. But after seeing you in action tonight, I think I can forgive you. Portia blushed under her heavy stage makeup. I know I was beastly too. Everyone, Renee. Playing a role is no excuse for that kind of behavior. I'm glad you can forgive me for it. She stared him straight in the eye. But now, can you forgive Liz as well? Renee flinched.
Portia.
Let's not bring that up. I loved Elizabeth. She was everything I could ever want in a girl, but she betrayed. No, she didn't betray you, Portia protested. You and Elizabeth didn't have a relationship when she started seeing Luke. Renee forced a laugh. Come now, Portia. Hasn't anyone ever told you it's presumptuous for a Brit to advise a Frenchman on matters of love? Portia shook her head. Oh no, you are absolutely not going to extract yourself from this conversation by trying to engage me in Franco-English sparring. I'm quite fond of Elizabeth. She was the only person who made an effort to befriend me at first, even while I was treating everyone so abominably. She folded her arms. Renee, before the Wakefields arrived in London, you hadn't set eyes on Elizabeth in months. Isn't it a wee bit possible that you've fallen in love with a memory rather than a real person? She didn't allow me to get reacquainted with the real person, Renee protested. She had hardly stepped off the plane when she began keeping company with that poet. You make poet sound like a dirty word. I can't help it. I love her. I don't want to see her with another beau. If you love Liz, you should want her to be happy. And she seems happy with Luke. Don't spoil that for her. But she said she cared for me. She does, Portia assured him. Your friendship is very important to Elizabeth right now, and who knows what might happen in the future. Phew. Can't be her mate, I mean friend. Now you'll lose her completely. Forever. Renee cocked his head. I don't know, Portia. I'm not sure I could handle being mates with Elizabeth. Especially if I have to watch her swooning over Luke Shepard's poetry. But I suppose you've given me something to think about. Good, Portia said. Now let's think about stopping somewhere for a bite to eat. I'll introduce you to the Old English standby, fish and chips. Renee grimaced. Hasn't anyone ever told you it's presumptuous for a Brit to advise a Frenchman on matters of food? How did Jessica enjoy her date last night with little Lord Pembroke? Luke asked Elizabeth, who sat beside him on the Sunday morning train back to London. I don't know, Elizabeth said. She was still asleep when we left this morning. I suppose she had a wonderful time, but I'm worried about her. Don't think Robert Pembroke is the right kind of guy for her. I've heard he's led kind of a wild life. What do you know about him? Luke narrowed his eyes. Quite a bit, actually. His father tries to quell the gossip, but the Pembrokes are the sort of people everyone adores talking about. Robert has been booted out of some of the finest schools in Britain. He's known for his attendance at the wildest parties, and he drives that Jaguar of his like a bloody maniac. In addition, his picture is in the tabloids every fortnight or so with a different female companion hanging onto his arm or gazing adoringly into his wealthy aristocratic eyes. What do girls like Jessica see in his type? Jessica's never been a very good judge of character, Elizabeth admitted. In fact, we never like the same people. She's not a bad person, Luke, but she gets carried away. She places too much importance on appearances. Luke touched Elizabeth's cheek for a brief, exquisite moment. And appearances, as we know, can be deceiving, he replied in the soft, lilting accent that made everything he said sound like poetry. I'm glad you're so different from your twin sister despite your identical appearances. And I'm glad that you're nothing like Robert Pembroke, Elizabeth asserted. Her cheek felt warm where Luke had touched it. In one area Robert has me topped, Luke admitted. He took his girlfriend out last night while I remained cloistered in my room, reading about werewolf imagery in Native American rites and rituals. I hope you weren't too lonely on your own. Elizabeth pulled an envelope out of her backpack and handed it to him. Actually, I was busy last night, she said, unable to conceal her excitement. Look what I found in the door frame of the room where Joy was murdered. Luke twisted the green threads in his fingers. Fibers from some sort of fabric, it looks like silk. His eyes widened. And this is animal fur. Elizabeth nodded, feeling every bit like Nancy Drew. When we find out where those green threads come from, we'll be much closer to identifying the murderer. And the fur proves that it's a werewolf. It doesn't necessarily prove anything, Elizabeth argued, trying to remember that first and foremost she was a journalist. We don't know for sure what that fur comes from. We most certainly do, Luke insisted. What else but a werewolf could have murdered Joy Singleton by ripping her throat open? Not to mention the London victims. The question is, who is the werewolf? I'm still not sure I believe in werewolves, but I'm willing to accept the possibility. Are you familiar with the words of your American poet Thoreau? Luke asked. The moon now rises to her absolute rule, and the husbandman and the hunter acknowledge her as their mistress. The werewolf is the ultimate hunter. Elizabeth. He can change shape whenever he's so moved, but when the full moon shines, he's at his greatest strength. And the full moon was shining on the night of Joy's death. Elizabeth suppressed a shudder. Well, whether the murderer is a werewolf or not, the constable said everyone is a suspect. So let's go over all the possibilities. Who could have killed Joy Singleton? Luke counted on his fingers. Besides Joy, the only people at Pembroke Manor this weekend were you and me, Jessica, the three Pembrokes, the servants, and Andrew Thatcher. I guess we can safely say it wasn't you, me, or Jessica. Elizabeth nodded. Right. And I can't believe Thatcher could have killed Joy. He was in love with her. Agreed, Luke said. That leaves the Pembrokes and the servants. You question Maria and Alistair. What's your opinion about them? I don't think they're murderers, Elizabeth said thoughtfully. But they were in the upstairs hallway around the time of the murder. And I'm sure they're hiding something. Maria saw someone or something in the hallway outside of the room where Joy was killed. She says she doesn't know who it was. I think she's lying. Interesting. What about Alistair? Elizabeth shook her head. I don't believe he saw anything. I'm not sure if Maria told him who she thinks she saw, but I know he's afraid to let her talk about it. Who are they afraid of? Pembroke, Elizabeth replied. The elder Lord Pembroke, that is. They were terrified that he would find out they spoke with me. Pembroke again, Luke said. And the only suspects we haven't eliminated are Lord Pembroke, Lady Pembroke, and Robert. It must be one of them. We can't accuse someone of murder based only on the process of elimination. Elizabeth reminded him. The Pembrokes could be innocent. Maybe we're wrong about one of the other suspects. Maybe there was some other servant in the house that night. Or maybe someone we've never heard of broke into the house and murdered Joy. Do you honestly believe that, Liz? Elizabeth hesitated before shaking her head.
No.
I guess I agree that the Pembrokes are our prime suspects. But we can't do anything about it until we have some firm evidence that implicates one of them. We'll find the evidence, Luke assured her. Werewolves are expert killers. But they aren't terribly skilled at covering their track. Chapter 3. £1 million for missing princess, screamed the front page of Sunday's London Journal. Elizabeth and Luke saw the headline at a crowded newsstand. In London, after they left Victoria Station that morning. Pembroke is at it again, Luke complained. He shoved through the crowd to pick up a copy of the newspaper, reaching past a teenage couple with stiff green hair and a middle-aged man walking a poodle. The dog began yelping loudly at Luke, straining at its leash. You'd better watch it, chap, the green-haired boy said, laughing at him. That little yapper is out for your blood. Elizabeth shuddered at the word blood. But Luke just cast the youth a dirty look and threw a few coins on the counter. Elizabeth could hear the sound of the poodle's frantic barking following them as she and Luke began walking along Victoria Street. The train station had a connection to the tube, but Elizabeth and Luke had chosen to walk. It's hard to believe that a newspaper with the journalist Sterling reputation would sensationalize this missing princess bit all over the front page day after day, Luke said, handing her the newspaper. You read it. Can't bear to. I thought Pembroke sunk to a new low yesterday, Elizabeth said. With that fantasy about the Tokyo bathhouse. Next it'll be missing princess abducted by space aliens. She scanned the article. At least today's story is true. The paper is putting up a huge reward for information leading to the return of Princess Eliana. It's just another excuse for Pembroke to cover up the really big story. Luke scoffed. This front page headline should be about Joy Singleton's murder. But why is he doing this? Elizabeth asked. He knows there's a murderer on the loose. Why would he endanger a whole city? He's protecting somebody, Luke said. And that's not surprising with the suspect list narrowed down to just Pembroke, his wife, and Robert. We still can't prove that, Elizabeth reminded him. We will, Luke said, staring with interest at the article. Actually, Pembroke may have done us a big favor with today's edition. £1 million. Just might induce someone to turn in the missing princess. He rolled his eyes. Unless, of course, she really has been kidnapped or is in Japan or has been abducted by space aliens. And if the princess is returned home soon, safe and sound, Pembroke will lose his smokescreen, Elizabeth said. He won't have an excuse to bury the murder stories at the back of the newspaper anymore. Luke stopped walking and faced Elizabeth. And, he said, his voice rising with excitement, people will realize that the journal made up those stories about Tokyo and kidnapping. Pembroke's cover-up will be exposed. Elizabeth shook her head. It's a nice theory, Luke, but nobody's going to turn Lena in. Nobody else knows who. She gasped, realizing what she had said. Luke's mouth dropped open. Lena? He asked loudly. He glanced around guiltily, and then softened his voice. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Please, Luke. I'm the only one who knows, and I promised her I wouldn't tell a soul. I never should have opened my big mouth. You won't tell anyone, will you? Luke pulled her to a secluded bench a few meters off the sidewalk. Elizabeth, are you telling me that your roommate, working-class Lena from Liverpool, is really the missing Princess Eliana, the youngest daughter of the Queen of England? Elizabeth nodded, sick that she divulged Eliana's secret. She's tired of being sheltered and elite. She wanted to meet real people and see what the real London is like, so she ran away from Buckingham Palace, moved into his, and found a job in a soup kitchen. Luke leaned over and kissed her. Elizabeth Wakefield, you are just full of Surprises. All you have to do now is write up an article about the princesses. Real whereabouts, and Pembroke's cover-up will be exposed. If Tony won't print it in the journal, I'm sure an editor at some other newspaper in town would be happy to. Elizabeth jumped up from the bench. Luke, I can't betray Lena's confidence. Besides, exposing the cover-up wouldn't do much good right now, not until we're sure of exactly what Pembroke's covering up. Luke sighed. I guess you're right, he admitted. And don't be alarmed. Won't reveal Her Royal Highness's secret if you don't want me to. In fact, I admire the girl for what she's doing. But when we have enough evidence to go to the police, you may need to convince Lena or Eliana to turn herself in. After all, lives are at stake. Elizabeth remembered the sight of Joy's body on the blood-spattered sheets of Jessica's bed. Her stomach gave a sickening lurch. Especially Jessica's life, she whispered. Welcome home, Eliana said to Elizabeth as the American girl walked into the dorm room at noon on Sunday. It felt good to put aside her fake Liverpudlian accent and speak instead in her natural, softer tones. Elizabeth was the only person she could truly be herself around. Then Eliana laughed. Home. It's strange how quickly I've come to think of this place as home. Elizabeth glanced around the spacious but messy dorm room and raised her eyebrows. My mother would be horrified if she knew where I was living, Lena continued. Actually, I called her again this morning from a payphone across town, so she can't trace me. I was afraid that today's journal article would upset her, a bounty on my head and all. So I called to tell her that I'm still all right, but that I can't bear the thought of going back to my old life yet. She's furious with me. I'm sure she's just concerned about your safety. That's for certain. Mum is so overprotective that it's like living with a prison warden. Elizabeth laughed. With Buckingham Palace as the world's best decorated prison. Did you see today's journal, by the way? The going rate for a princess is now £1 million. Don't worry about anyone trying to collect it, Elizabeth said reassuringly. Your secret is safe with me. Then she looked away, blushing. Liz, what's wrong? Elizabeth sat down on the bottom bunk. To tell you the truth, your secret isn't safe with me. I accidentally told Luke about you just a half hour ago. I'm sorry, but it slipped out. Eliana felt a stab of fear. Is he going to turn me in? No, of course not, Elizabeth said quickly. You can trust Luke and me even though I haven't given you much reason to. Eliana relaxed again. Elizabeth looked so miserable that she felt sorry for her. It's all right, Liz. I know you trust Luke. That's good enough for me. Besides, I'm too happy today to let it bother me. And I owe it all to you. Elizabeth looked at her expectantly, though Eliana could see that her mind wasn't really on the conversation. David and I went out together last night and had a marvelous time. Eliana bubbled. You know, I've lived in London all my life, but I've missed so much of the city. David and I explored it together. We were real tourists. Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral. We even dropped by Buckingham Palace to watch the changing of the guard. Of course, I wore my dark glasses for that. Elizabeth smiled. I'm glad you had a good time. It's amazing how much David and I have in common, Elizabeth. For one thing, our politics are exactly alike. She stared at her fingernails for a moment. He'll hate me if he ever learns the truth about who I am. You know, we both despise the whole idea of royalty, the idea that some people were born to have power and wealth and position just because they're descended from a line of interbred snobs. You have a much better system in America. We have problems in America too, Elizabeth said absently. Eliana crossed the room and sat beside her. You sound as if you're 1,000 miles away. What's the matter, Liz? Are you still upset about telling Luke my secret? Elizabeth shook her head.
No, Eliana. I'm fine.
Eliana clapped her hand to her mouth. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you. Here's a bit of news to cheer you up. René was in here looking for you this morning. He has to attend an embassy function for most of the day, but he left you a message. He asked me to tell you he's sorry for acting, as he put it, like a spurned lure. He wants to be friends now and asked if you'll meet him for lunch tomorrow. Elizabeth's blue-green eyes lit up. That's wonderful, Eliana. I'll leave him a note accepting the invitation. Good. But you still haven't told me what's wrong, Elizabeth. Didn't you have a good time at Pembroke Manor?
No.
I didn't, she said, getting up from the bunk.
Suddenly I'm
starving. Will you excuse me if I go downstairs to raid the kitchen? I'll fill you in on what happened later. Eliana watched the American girl thoughtfully as she headed out of the room. Elizabeth had seemed agitated for most of the week ever since the night she and Eliana came across the mangled body of a Yorkshire Terrier on a foggy London street. Elizabeth had recognized poor Poo-Poo as the subject of her missing dog story at the newspaper. Eliana shivered at the memory of the Yorkie's body, the blood on its throat, glistening crimson in the moonlight. She couldn't imagine what had happened at Pembroke Manor to further upset Elizabeth, but somehow she knew it was related to Poo-Poo's bloody death. Jessica walked into the kitchen of his Sunday afternoon and set her suitcase on the floor. She was surprised to see her sister at the table, reading the most recent issue of the London Journal and eating leftover chicken. I didn't know you were back, Elizabeth began. Robert just dropped me off, Jessica explained. I haven't even been upstairs yet. Is there any more of that fried chicken? Help yourself. Jessica poked the front page of Elizabeth's newspaper. How about that $1 million reward Robert's father is offering for the missing princess? She asked. The Pembrokes are just about the most generous people I've ever met. It's £1 million, Liz corrected her. Jessica rolled her eyes. What difference does it make? $1 million is $1 million. Somebody's going to get rich by finding Eliana. Too bad it can't be. Maybe we've been investigating the wrong news story. If you were princess, where would you go? Instead of answering her question, Elizabeth changed the subject. How was your dinner date with Robert last night? Jessica sighed dreamily. You should have seen the restaurant, Liz. There were enough forks at my place setting to stock the whole silver department at Simpson's department store back home. We ate Chateaubriand, that steak you know, and trifle a scrumptious dessert with layers of fruit and custard and sponge cake and I don't know what else. There was candlelight and soft music. And the world's best-looking waiters. It was the most elegant dinner I've ever had. How nice, Elizabeth said without much enthusiasm. Robert is just amazing, Liz. He knows absolutely everyone worth knowing in England. A member of Parliament stopped by our table to say hello. A member of Parliament. It sounds like fun. Then why do you look as if you've just eaten a sour pickle? Oh, don't mind me, Jessica. I'm still recovering from what happened this weekend. What's to recover from? It's over and done with. Of course I feel awful about Joy, but there isn't anything we can do about it. She would want us to go on having a great time in England. And Liz, I am having one heck of a great time. I haven't been this happy since before Sam died. I didn't think I would ever love another boy the way I loved Sam. But I do, Liz. I'm in love with Robert Pembroke. This is definitely the big L. Elizabeth looked startled. Are you sure it's Robert you're in love with and not just the money and the celebrities and the expensive dinners? Jessica folded her arms impatiently. Give me a little credit, Liz. I'm not that superficial. Robert is kind, generous, and a lot of fun. He really cares about me. Of course, having tons of money and being related to royalty is always a plus in a boyfriend. But you know I wouldn't date someone who was naff or a real narc just because he was rich. Naff? Narc? I had no idea you were bilingual. They're British words, Jessica said with an air of importance. Robert taught them to me. Naff means uncool, and a narc is a nerd like your friend Winston Egbert in Sweet Valley. In fact, most of your mates in Sweet Valley are narcs. My friend Winston is our friend, and as for... Oh, cool off, Liz. I'm only kidding, she lied. The point is that I'm in love with Robert Pembroke and he's in love with me. My own twin sister should be happy for me. I'm happy that you're happy, Jess, but I think you're rushing into this. Isn't it awfully soon to be talking about love? I mean, you met Robert less than a week ago. There are probably a lot of things you don't know about him. Jessica jumped from her seat. What did Robert ever do to you? She yelled. Why do you hate him so much? I don't hate Robert. It's just that. Besides, you've known Luke less than a week too. Why is it all right for you to be serious about him if it's not all right for me and Robert? You're only 4 minutes older than me, Liz. You have no right to tell me how to live my life. But Jessica, I don't have to stand here and listen to you criticize the guy I love. Jessica shouted. I'm fed up with your bossy holier-than-thou attitude. She stormed out of the room. Elizabeth pounded a fist into her open palm as she watched Jessica's retreating back. Sometimes she makes me so mad, she said aloud. Then she noticed Eliana hesitating in the doorway. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, Liz, Eliana began. And I'll leave if you want. Me too. But are you all right? I was reading in the library and I couldn't help hearing. It's okay, Elizabeth said. You might as well come in. And I'm fine. I just get so angry with Jessica sometimes. I don't know why I bother trying to help her. All I get for it is yelled at. She's so absorbed in little Lord Robert that she won't pay attention to anyone else. But I don't trust Robert or his family. And what happened at Pembroke Manor this weekend certainly didn't increase my confidence. I just know they're hiding something. I'm still in the dark about just what happened this weekend, Eliana reminded her. Elizabeth took a deep breath and described her discovery of Joy's body in Jessica's bed Saturday morning. I'm not accusing Robert of being a murderer, she admitted. At least I don't think I am. But somebody who was in that house this weekend is a murderer, and the evidence seems to point to the Pembrokes. She decided not to mention the werewolf connection just yet, realizing how crazy it would sound. Even aside from the murders, I don't think Robert Pembroke is the kind of guy my sister should be going out with. He has a terrible reputation and I don't want to see her get hurt. After all, she hardly knows him and now she's convinced that she's in love. Tell me honestly, Eliana, she concluded. Was I out of line to caution her against jumping into this relationship so quickly? Eliana looked thoughtful. No, she decided. It's never out of line to be concerned about somebody you love. But in this case I can tell you that you don't need to worry so much. I know Robert. In fact, the Pembrokes are distant cousins of mine. Certainly, the family isn't everyone's cup of tea. They're much too aristocratic. She smiled ironically. Robert's been a bit of a handful for his parents, Eliana continued. But it's only with schoolboy pranks and that type of thing. He's not a bad sort. And I'm 100% certain that he doesn't have it in him to be a killer. The worst injury Jessica could get from Robert is a broken heart when he moves on to his next conquest. Elizabeth sighed deeply. I'm relieved to hear you say so, Eliana. I hope you're right. I do know that there's no real evidence for accusing him of murder. Of course there isn't, Eliana said. And what possible motive would he have for murdering the young woman at Pembroke Manor? Elizabeth shook her head. None that I can think of. Maybe you're overreacting to Jessica's relationship with Robert. It's only natural to want to protect your sister, but she's 16 years old enough to make her own decisions. And old enough to make her own mistakes, Elizabeth pointed out. But you're right. If Robert turns out to be a rat, Jessica will have to learn about it on her own, though I still plan to keep an eye on her. Elizabeth fingered the newspaper on the table in front of her. If you know Robert, she said thoughtfully, then you know his father as well. You of all people must have noticed the way the journal is exploiting the missing princess story. What would Pembroke have to gain from plastering you all over his newspaper? Eliana shrugged. The coverage is annoying, but I don't question Lord Pembroke's interest in using his newspaper to help find me. As I said, we are cousins. All the same, it seems like there would be more important news to cover than this steady stream of princess stories.
No offense.
Eliana laughed. I suppose it must seem strange to an American, but to the British, anything dealing with the royal family, even idle gossip, is important news. Come on, Eliana. A kidnapping? A Tokyo bathhouse? Both of those stories were based entirely on hearsay. All right, so the journal has gone a bit overboard. But I'm certain the stories are selling a lot of newspapers. Why do you think there's something sinister behind them? Joy's murder was not the first one of its kind. You know about Dr. Neville and Poo-Poo. There was also a nurse about a month ago. Every time the newspaper had the information, but buried it toward the back of the paper or refused to run the stories altogether. Doesn't it seem odd to you that the owner of the journal was at a murder scene yesterday, yet there's no mention of it in today's newspaper? He's protecting somebody, Eliana, and I intend to find out who. Actually, it doesn't seem odd in the least, Eliana said. Not if you know Lord Pembroke. The man has a terrific fear of scandal. For instance, he had The courtroom closed to the public the last time Robert was arrested for traffic violations. And when Robert was kicked out of his most recent school, Lord Pembroke endowed a new wing for the school's library in exchange for having the records say Robert transferred out of his own accord. So you think Lord Pembroke is using the princess stories to cover up something terrible Robert has done? I didn't say that, Eliana protested. I'm just trying to explain that Lord Pembroke doesn't want to sully the family name, for instance, by allowing a newspaper article that says a body was found at Pembroke Manor. He may not be covering up the identity of the murderer, Liz. He could be more interested in covering up the location of the murder. I know what it's like to have your family's name dragged through the mud, Elizabeth admitted, biting her lip. Not long ago I was in court myself. Jessica's boyfriend was killed in an accident, and I was driving the car. The accident turned out to be someone else's fault, but I would have given anything for a news blackout up until that point. Eliana looked startled. Oh Liz, how awful that must have been for you. I had
no idea.
But maybe that experience will help you understand Pembroke's actions. I remember hearing that the Pembrokes were involved in some sort of scandal 15 or 20 years ago. Since then Lord Pembroke has been fanatical about keeping the family name clean. What kind of scandal? Elizabeth asked. I don't remember. It must have happened a year or two before I was born. But as a child I heard of a deep dark secret that was causing the Pembrokes great embarrassment. Very interesting, Elizabeth mused, wondering if the old scandal was somehow tied in with the current goings-on. Now if I could only find out what the big scandal was. Unfortunately, the Pembrokes were the only logical source of information on the old scandal. Jessica would have a fit if Elizabeth went anywhere near Robert. Besides, Robert would have been a baby at the time. The elder Lord Pembroke was already suspicious of Elizabeth. That left only Robert's mother. Elizabeth decided she would have to question Lady Pembroke about the 20-year-old scandal and about the recent murders. I'll get to the bottom of this mystery if it's the last thing I do.